It looks like a gigantic penis from certain angles. Which, I mean, I guess if you wanted to be memorialized, there are worse ways to be memorialized. But $10 million they spent on this thing. It's MLK Day. Many of you are still working. Some of you are off work. But every MLK Day, I'm always kind of entertained by the ridiculousness of the FBI deciding from their official Twitter handles that they want to wish Martin Luther King Day, best wishes, whatever you want to classify it. I'll read, and then Buck will discuss here for a moment why I've never been that big of a trustworthy fan of the FBI. On this 40th anniversary of MLK Day as a federal holiday, the FBI honors one of the most prominent leaders of the civil rights movement and reaffirms its commitment to Dr. King's legacy of fairness and equal justice for all. They spied on Martin Luther King, the FBI did, attempted to get him to commit suicide, threatened him regularly with imprisonment. This was one of J. Edgar Hoover's big obsessions. And if you really want to study the FBI and maybe then take a step back and say, I'm not sure that I trust the leadership of the FBI to this day, because I do not. The entire J. Edgar Hoover era of the FBI, Buck, is, I think maybe it's one of the least discussed aspects of American history, because it's so sordid and so nasty what he was involved in. But, Buck, it's pretty crazy, and I think it's an element of history that I would encourage everybody to pay attention to, because it makes me, and I bet will make you, a little bit more understanding of how the Russia collusion hoax and all that could happen when you read about the J. Edgar Hoover era of the FBI.
Well, the era was 50 years.
Yes.
Right?
He lived a long time.
So when you think about it, I mean, J. Edgar Hoover led the FBI for nearly half a century, from 1924 until 1972.
I mean, that's crazy.
And something, isn't that amazing? I mean, when you hear that, you go, I mean, that's like Fauci duration in government service. That's very long. But also, I think it is worth noting, this is a little bit of a step away from the MLK specific FBI activities. But the left, and therefore the Democrat Party in this country, hates Hoover because he was an anti-communist and was effectively right about the communist menace and communist threat in this country. It's amazing when people throw around these terms. They'll say, oh, it's the new McCarthyism and Red Scare. And we're all supposed to act like this was the great rise of fascism in America. Communists stole literal nuclear secrets from our nuclear program, gave them to the Soviets, who then were able to detonate nuclear weapons of their own, and probably, you could argue, was instrumental in the North Korean invasion of South Korea, leading to the Korean War. I mean, when you start looking at the effects of the communist penetration of this country, which has been almost entirely whitewashed from our history, and people really think, they go, oh, all this McCarthyism, all this scare. There were hundreds, and this is from the Venona Project, which was a top secret military. Effectively, they were able to surveil or had tapped into cable traffic, diplomatic cable traffic back to the Soviet Union, back to Moscow. There were hundreds of actual communist Soviet agents in the United States. It was all true. It was all real. They were at the State Department. They were at the OSS, which then became the CIA. They were in the White House. And the rewriting of the history is amazing and deeply troubling, because I think people graduate from school now, Clay, and they think there was no Communist Party USA had people who were being straight up handled by the KGB. This is all fact, and it is completely pushed out because labor unions, the Democrat Party, there was a lot of coziness there with these commies who had very, very anti-American designs on this country. So anyway, I think that they hate Hoover for a lot of reasons, but that's one of the main reasons they hate Hoover, or rather why he's turned into such a villain.
Well, and that was the reason that he justified the surveillance of Martin Luther King, was the idea that the civil rights movement was infiltrated by communist, advocates.
It was.
There were communists everywhere. at the time.
Right, but this is the point. I mean, there were communists who infiltrated these things. Because, Clay, anywhere where the Soviets could exercise leverage but also create dissension in America, they thought was to their strategic advantage. So, this is the truth.
Which is why the China story is, it seems like there's finally starting to be recognition about the fact that China has been using our American cultural institutions to try to tear down American-related
Confucius Institutes and donating. Oh, the Penn Biden Center got how much? I mean, or, the UPenn, after the Penn Biden Center got set up, got how many millions of dollars from it? Universities, by the way, are one of the main ways that foreign governments, even oppositional governments like China to the United States, exercise influence here. It is a huge problem. It's also a massive cover that is used for espionage operations, as we know. I mean, there are all these Chinese nationals who are saying, oh, yeah, I want to go. If you go and study at the highest level, nuclear engineering at, Caltech or MIT or something, you're going to maybe come into not only you being trained at the highest level, but you also may be coming into contact with sensitive government programs depending on your access and who you're working with.
Well, and I see it in a big way because I came out of the world of sports with the way that China has used propaganda from American athletes to tear down the legitimacy and justification of American institutions while simultaneously not saying a word about China's human rights violations and authoritarian government. LeBron James, a perfect example of this. Anytime anything remotely bad happens to the United States government is awful. And a lot of people followed LeBron's lead, and we certainly see it in the movie industry. We certainly see it in Hollywood. The amount of money that China has spent to allow itself, while they are enabling and endorsing destructive comments about the United States, they don't allow a word to be said negative about their own government.
The first place that authoritarian, totalitarian, communist, you name it, theocratic, pardon me. The first way that regimes, whether you're talking about China, Iran, go down the list, North Korea, you know what their first attack on America always is? Pretty much, we're so racist.
Yeah.
Which is amazing coming from a country like North Korea, which is basically built on a hierarchy of racial superiority of North Koreans over everybody else, and everybody else is subhuman. But anyway, the point is they try to exacerbate the divisions within our own country for their benefit, or really to exaggerate the divisions within our own country, because as anyone who spent enough time in a lot of other parts of the world will tell you, America is actually the example of all of us getting along incredibly well.
I think there's a very strong argument America is the least racist country that's ever existed in the history of the world. And certainly being lectured by China, which doesn't allow immigration effectively, right? And North Korea, good Lord. I mean, that is a crazy man's country. But they use our own internal criticisms against us and try to blow them up on a global scale.
Now, neither you nor I would consider ourselves to be. I think Clay's movie taste is very solid, I have to say. I thought there's something we might be able to go back and forth and fight a little more, but generally speaking, most of the time I'm like, yeah, no, he's right. That's a great movie. So we're both, I think, high-level movie critics. But art and sculpture, not really in either of our... I'm not a guy who goes wandering around the galleries in Chelsea talking about how, yes, this painting with just two stripes across it that looks like a 5-year-old could do. This is man's inhumanity to man, or, whatever, right? Yes. You come up with something on the spot. However, I do think there are some limits to what there's some basics that we could all agree on when it comes to art and sculpture. They unveiled a new MLK sculpture. It is up on clayandbuck.com. I would ask anybody listening right now, if you can, if you're obviously not, if you're driving, safety first, but if you're near a smartphone or a computer and you can, go to clayandbuck.com, check out this new sculpture, because we got to talk about it when we come back. We got to have a little discussion about the new MLK honoring sculpture.
In Boston is where they unveiled it. So It is, and just think about it. If you can unveil a sculpture dedicated to Martin Luther King, basically on Martin Luther King Day, and it can be publicly criticized on CNN, it's probably a sculpture that's not that great of a sculpture. Just toss that out.
We cover a lot of ground here. It's one of the things we do on this show. We a wide range of topics. Obviously, the news and politics and what's going on with all of that, first and foremost. It's a politics show. It's a what's going on show. But we do culture. We do food. I was just talking about quail eggs. They're quite delicious, as I said. You know, you crack. They're a little tough to crack. They're tiny, but it's kind of fun. And if you get them just right, Clay, it looks like you've got a tiny little fried egg like you would make for like a dollhouse or something. You have a tiny little fried egg. Anyway, I know it's random, but I'm just saying the egg shortage is a real thing going on across the country right now, and apparently also the baby formula shortage. We cover a lot of ground. Occasionally we get into artistic criticism, and that's where we are right now. What's fascinating about this is you would think that to criticize a new statue that was meant to show respect to Martin Luther King on Martin Luther King Day, that would be just beyond the pale. Nobody would ever do such a thing. Well, in this case, kind of everybody's doing it, or a lot of people are doing it. I wouldn't say everybody, but a lot of folks are just on artistic grounds. This has nothing to do with Martin Luther King, his legacy, anything else. It's just, who made this statue? It's called The Embrace, and it's by the artist Hank Willis Thomas. So I'm not going to be getting this guy to make my bust. You know, I think that's, I'm not quite at bust level yet, Clay, but maybe one day. So symbolize the hug Dr. King and Coretta Scott King shared after Dr. King won the 1964 Nobel Peace Prize. Here's the way the Washington Post wrote about it. Martin Luther King Jr. statue in Boston draws online mockery and disdain. Now, even some people on the left were upset about this because where's his head? Which is a fair, like, why are you just showing arms and hands? It could be anybody. You know, there's nothing about this no person would walk past this and be like, oh, yes, commemorating the greatness of Dr. Martin Luther King and the revolution in justice and racial healing, or a path to racial healing for this country. They would look at this and say, what is this? And I'm just observing here. When people look at the sculpture from certain directions, all they do is they say, I can't believe somebody didn't see this the way I'm seeing it, because this is not what they were trying to go for here.
It looks like a gigantic penis from certain angles, which, I mean, I guess if you wanted to be memorialized, there are worse ways to be memorialized. But $10 million they spent on this thing. And I sometimes art in the immediate aftermath of its creation gets ridiculed, right? For instance, the Vietnam War Memorial, if you have been to it in Washington, D.C., very powerful now.
Amazing.
I think quite beloved. Initially was not thought to be a great representation of a memorial. I don't think that this sculpture is going to have that kind of trajectory where, as people spend more time around it, it becomes more beloved. I also wonder, you do a lot of different mocks before you make a sculpture. How is it possible that this guy came up with this design and everybody said, this is a $10 million art project, we love it? Is it, and I don't even know, what's the racial background of this guy? Were people afraid to criticize an MLK sculpture design, white people, because they were afraid they'd be called racist if they pointed out that it looked ridiculous? I bet that happened.
I think that's I think it's, by the way, irrespective of who the artist designing this may be, I think that there's just nobody would be willing along this process to say anything, and certainly to say this is, to some people, I'm trying to think of how to say this, Clay. You just said it, but there are some anatomical associations that are unintentional. That's the best way I could put this. That when people look at this, they go, okay, That looks like something else.
I think if you are a white guy or girl who is the kind of person that would be on the board raising $10 million for an MLK statue, you are so terrified of saying anything racially inappropriate, particularly as it connotes to a MLK sculpture, that there were probably a lot of people who saw this and thought, and I'm not sure this is $10 million well spent. I'm not sure this honors Dr. King's legacy very well, but they were afraid to speak out because this is what diversity and inclusion does. A big part of diversity and inclusion is knowing who is allowed in their world, who is allowed to have an opinion and who isn't. Buck, these white people who inevitably helped to raise some of this $10 million were terrified of being considered gauche, of being considered inappropriate, of not being diverse and inclusive enough to even, I bet, say a word of criticism about this design.
Think about if there's like a design art committee here. I mean, just put yourself in this position, Clay. You're going around. You're in the room. If you're having a conversation about this sculpture, you're talking about people who are artists, people who are on the cutting edge of culture. You're going to have a lot of people announcing pronouns, very sensitive to the wokeness of the moment. You think any of them are going to say anything about this design that undermines it in any way? No. And so what you have, like I said, go to clayandbuck.com. It's really about the angle you look at it. I'm just going to say that. From certain angles, it's
a gigantic penis.
I'm just telling you to look at it from certain angles and then just wonder, how could they not have seen what we all see?